Hello everybody and welcome to another, well, who knows how many days of Amiga. It's meant to be 12, but Christmas was yesterday. And if you're listening in June, happy summer. But yes, ranking worst to best. Today is number 5, so we're well and truly into the good stuff now. But yes, today's video may be a little bit controversial because some people are going to say, how could you, Vicky? You can't put this in at number 5. Well, let's face it, it could have almost been number 6, but yeah, it's in at number 5. So if you want to know how I'm ranking the Amiga systems, it's explained in the video description, but essentially this is a slightly irreverent take at the Amiga series that was released by Commodore and latterly for a short period by Amiga Technologies, and just my take on it, on also whether I recommend you buying one in this day and age. So, without further ado, in at number 5, Pop Pickers, is the Amiga 3000. I'm sorry, everybody. I know everybody is now going, how could you, Vicky? Everybody knows that the Amiga 3000 was the best Commodore Amiga ever released. Yeah, well, I want to explain why I'm putting it here, and I don't want to do it just through dry stats or history this time. You know, I've made 7 videos that are like that already, so I think you're due a rest. But seriously speaking, I feel that there are a few little things surrounding the whole my ranking of this so-called, unicorn in the Amiga series that provide me an opportunity to make a little bit of commentary about the retro gaming stroke computing scene in general, for you to hold more Rotten Tomatoes and all that kind of stuff at me. But anyway, before I get into all of that, the Amiga 3000, what is it? Well, it's this still rather fetching looking slimline desktop PC style thing. Released in June of 1990, it's essentially a integration of all the things that the Amiga 2500 did, along with a few other little extras such as an updated Amiga expansion bus and a few other little niceties such as, at last, a flicker fixer and a scan doubler so you can use VGA monitors and flicker-free interlaced screens. But I'll get into that all in good time. So, why am I putting what everybody says is the best Amiga that Commodore ever made in at number 5 and not at number 1? Well, I should have probably said this at the very start of this series, but I have had experience of using all of the Amigas that I've featured in this series, and at one point or another I have also owned most of them as well. Admittedly, not recently, but I certainly back in the 90s and, well, the year 2000, because that's when I stopped using Amigas, I've had quite extensive experience with this, so I feel that I can provide a little bit of context in a way that you can't quite get from just reading Wikipedia. So, so why am I taking potentially a controversial stance on this? Well, let me ask you a question. How good is the Sharp X68000? Now, there'll be a whole bunch of people who'll be just like, what? I don't know. And then there'll be a whole bunch of other people who go, oh, well, everybody knows that was like the Japanese Amiga. It's just the best. It had the amazing arcade ports, fantastic system. If only we got it in the West, it would have just killed everything and yada, yada, yada kind of thing. You know, the best system in the world kind of thing, and definitely worth spending thousands of pounds on. And for some people, that definitely holds true. You know, it's not for me to say what to spend your money on or what I think things are worth, but I can say for myself that I feel that it's another unicorn. And I feel that in the case of the Sharp X68000, most of its reputation is based on what people have heard rather than what they've directly experienced through extended periods of ownership. Now, my take on the Sharp X68000 is that it is a fantastically powerful system that we didn't get in the West. Okay? It did have some amazing arcade ports in it, no doubt about it. Is it as great as everybody says it is? I don't think so. I think it's quite unreliable in some cases, and also the operating system on it is horrible. I mean, if you've got any, Human 68K or whatever that graphical user interface that it has, fans out there, I'm really sorry, but the Amiga's operating system is much more friendly to use than Human 68K. So even the unicorns have things that, some people will see as like, oh, well, is it that? I just want to put it out there that just because the oft-repeated wisdom is that it is X, Y, and Z, doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to share that opinion, or that you should share that opinion. And in my case, I think the Sharp 68000 X68000 has some wonderful games on it. But are the ports of, say, Strider so good that I want to burn my Mega Drive copy of Strider and never touch another copy of Strider on a Mega Drive ever again? Absolutely not. Strider on a Mega Drive is fantastic. I would happily play that. So I don't feel that I need to buy a Sharp X68000 for that reason. And yes, it has amazing ports of Street Fighter as well, but I enjoy playing them on the Super Nintendo, or Super Famicom as I have here in Japan. So it doesn't mean that because, say, maybe the Sharp X68000 might be the absolute best of the best experience that you can have, doesn't mean that it negates all the other experiences that you can have for more, let's say, accessible money, or potentially no money at all, depending on which route you go to enjoying these things. But anyway, let's not anger the people in the copyright department. Essentially what I'm saying is, chasing perfection is a bit of a mug's game at anything in life, to be honest with you, whether that's retro computing or gaming. And I think this is somewhat perpetuated by what we see on YouTube and social media in general, insofar as that we see plenty of examples of big YouTubers who get machines donated to them or have the means to purchase these machines, and it makes us types who have an Amiga 500 feel a bit like, oh. Or maybe us types that can only afford an Amiga 500 go, never be as good. And I think we should ignore all of that. I think basically we should just concentrate on the facts, and the facts are that, it's not necessary to have an Amiga 3000 to have the best Amiga experience. So don't get too swayed by all of these people who have these fantastic systems and collections on YouTube. It's just not important. This chase for perfection will kill all of your love for what you set out to do in the first place. Like which port of Strider is better, which port of this is better, and so forth, and it all gets a little bit silly. If you're having a good time playing Rolling Thunder on the Amiga, God knows how, but if you are, then who's to say that you have to play it on the NES, or that you have to simply play it on this other system, or whatever it is. You should just enjoy things for what they are. Don't be swayed by the fact that the big YouTubers have all of these wonderful systems, and therefore your experience of them is just never going to be quite as good because you don't own the unicorn, so to speak. Just enjoy things on your own terms in life. And if you're wondering why the television is blank, it's because I've recorded this after I finished recording the video, and I felt that I really needed to clarify this point. So yeah, there's my I don't know, self-help part of this video, shall we call it that? Yeah, anyway, cut. But the Amiga 3000, I feel, falls into this category as well. And yeah, I think at the time this was the best Amiga that Commodore released. It was more well-rounded than the Amiga 4000 was, and I'll go into explaining why that was in that particular episode. But I feel that a lot of the things that it definitely offered as distinct advantages for the Amiga back in 1990, and also when I was using it in the late 90s, have been somewhat negated by the progress of technology in the meantime. So, with that all said, the big thing is that a lot of the stuff that this offers, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that the vast majority of people who want to buy an Amiga these days, or whatever, they're not going to need it. Because they're going to be messing about with playing games, they're going to be messing about with things like DualX Paint, they're going to be messing about with things like ProTracker or Optimed and so forth. How many of you are actually looking to set up a video toaster system or a 16-bit, recording system with bars and pipes and all the rest of it? There might be a very small handful of you, but I would wager that the vast majority of people who have picked up an Amiga in recent years as like part of their retro gaming interests have done so to play Lemmings or, heaven forbid, Super Frog. But anyway, another controversial opinion. So I want to break down why some of the things that were really good about the Amiga 3000 hold slightly less relevance, I think, in 2022. Straight off the bat, the Amiga 3000 allows you to expand the memory directly on the motherboard. You don't need an expansion card like most Amigas. That's great. But the downside is it uses a type of RAM called zip RAM. It doesn't use SIMs like you do in the Amiga 4000, for example. And they were hard to get hold of back in the day, and they're almost like unicorn dust these days. They're just so expensive, and they're also fiddly to upgrade as well. So it is a benefit, but it's not that easy on an Amiga 3000, unfortunately. Next, it includes a 68030 or MAFCO processor on the motherboard. Also a good thing, but expansions for all sorts of Amigas are now readily available, taking it well beyond that built-in processor, and arguably for a cheaper price than the equivalent Amiga 3000 upgrades cost. So yeah, there is that. And I had a little look. It seems one of the most readily available acceleration options for your Amiga 3000 is the A3660 card, which is like a beefed up 3640 redesign card kind of thing. But whereas if you want something a bit cheaper, you just don't seem to have those options there. So yeah, it does offer the faster processor on the motherboard, but it's not the be-all end-all of Amiga stuff, shall we say. Next, it has DMA SCSI built in, which means nice fast hard disk access, fast CD-ROM access if you plug in a CD-ROM drive. It offers a lot of peripheral compatibility, which was really good back in the day. It meant that the Amiga finally came by, well, this particular model came with a hard disk by default. And when you was accessing it, the system didn't slow down, everything all just ran smoothly in parallel. It was wonderful. And you could plug in scanners through the external SCSI port, you could plug in a CD-ROM drive, you could add another hard disk, a tape drive. But in this day and age, are many of us looking to plug in a SCSI scanner onto an Amiga? I'd wager that it's in a minority. I think most of us are just using some multifunction device on our PCs or Macintoshes these days, so just saying. And how many of us really need to access Amiga software on CD-ROM? Again, it's going to be a slightly larger proportion of people, but I feel that that's still going to be a little bit in the minority. So, you know, it's less important than what it was 20 odd years ago. And how many of us need to plug in spinning SCSI hard disks these days? Again, I would say not that many of us. So yes, you can buy SCSI to SD systems, but they are more expensive than, say, just like the simple ID to compact flash adapters that you can put in a 600, a 1200 or a 4000. And they can sometimes be just a little bit more involved, so just putting it out there. And also the SCSI implementation on the Amiga 3000, at least in the 3000 I had, was not always 100% reliable. Could lead to some system instability or peripherals not being recognised, because on some of the earlier Amiga 3000s, the SCSI chip was just a little bit buggy. So I think they did go on to resolve this issue in later Amiga 3000s, but my experience was sometimes that you plug in a CD-ROM drive and it wouldn't be recognised. Reboot the Amiga, there it was. Clear as, you know, it was just a bit finicky like that. Less of an issue these days if you're not using those peripherals, but just putting it out there that the SCSI that it has built in was good, but how much use does it have today? And also in some Amiga 3000s it wasn't perfect. The next thing, scan doubling, flicker fixing, which allows you to plug in a 31 kHz VGA standard monitor into it. 20 odd years ago, that was fantastic still. It meant I could just get any old cheapest chips, you know, PC style monitor, and it worked. Beautiful rock steady screens to use in PageStream and Dulux Paint and Wordworth and Final Writer and all this stuff, and it meant that I could do all of this stuff without any flicker. At last, the thing that we've been calling out for as standard on an Amiga for so long. But in this day and age, it's less important because we can readily get Amiga RGB cables that go to SCART, and then through a third-party solution, we can get really rock-solid pictures on our LCD or whatever screens these days. And because of the nature of LCD, those interlace screens don't flicker. So less important these days than it used to be. Just putting it out there, just saying, there are plenty of SCART to HDMI converters which will allow you to plug in a high quality PC monitor with HDMI input these days. So yeah, 20 odd years ago it was good. And then we get to Zorro 3, the Amiga's expansion bus. Now, Zorro 3 was faster than what was in the Amiga 2000, and this does provide a lot of expansion capability, and I want to talk about a little bit more about that towards the end of this video. But yeah, the video toaster was actually unfortunately just too big to fit in the desktop Amiga 3000 here. You could do it with a bit of case modification, but because NewTek never sent a pre-release card to Commodore, unfortunately the case just can't quite fit it in. So you're in many ways better off with an Amiga 2000 series machine or an Amiga 4000 for a video toaster setup. No problems with the Amiga 3000 tower, of course. They had obviously ironed out all the issues by then. But yes, you're going to need to modify your beautiful Amiga 3000 if you want to do this. And obviously there are other expansion cards available, like bridge cards, or bridge boards, which I'll talk about at the end of this video, RAM cards, MJPEG capture cards, 16-bit sound cards, graphics cards and so forth. But again, with my Amiga 3000, I had limited ability to get stuff to coexist. So for example, when I tried to use a Cybervision 64 3D card in my Amiga 3000 back in the day, along with a RAM card and a bridge board, which I also had an ISA VGA graphics card for, it wouldn't work. Plugged the Cybervision into the Amiga 4000 that I also had, worked first time, no trouble whatsoever. Same thing with Amiga accelerator cards actually. Both the Commodore A3640 and an Apollo 4060 card that I tried in it back in the day, no dice on the Amiga 3000. Both worked straight off the bat on Amiga 4000, so not always universally the case, but sometimes you get these things with these big box Amigas that, on the whole, a lot better than PCs, you know, all that configuration of jumpers and IRQs and all this kind of stuff. But Amiga Auto Config, as fantastic as it is, does sometimes have the odd little annoyance that, you know, maybe the vast majority of people don't have, but you end up having, kind of thing. So I'm just putting it out there that all the things that you hear about the Amiga, a lot of them are absolutely true, but don't just repeat them because you heard somebody else say them. There is a little bit more nuance to this stuff than perhaps meets the eye. And so, with all of those things said, this is where all of those benefits that the Amiga 3000 absolutely had in 1990, even in the late 1990s when I had one and used it for about 2 or 3 years, I feel that they have diminished value in this day and age. So therefore, if you're just somebody who wants to do Pro Tracker, Optimed, Deluxe Paint, Brilliance, maybe a bit of using Amiga DOS or whatever kind, you know, Amiga OS, playing games, that kind of stuff, I would really say to yourself, do I really need a system that looks like this and pay £1,500 plus for a good copy, or could I actually get away with having an Amiga 500 with an accelerator, or an Amiga 1200 for example? Just putting it out there. As somebody who has used a big box Amiga back in the day, you know, I suppose I never had that experience of only ever having an Amiga 500 or an Amiga 1200, for example, and always wondering what these big box Amigas were like. I've kind of been through that, and perhaps I can give you a little bit of perspective. So yes, the Amiga 3000 is definitely a fantastic machine, but it's not like the be-all end-all. It isn't a unicorn. I mean, it's a unicorn in terms of its apparent rarity and price these days, but I think the vast majority of people who are actually looking to buy an Amiga system will be better served by buying an Amiga 500 with a decent, you know, accelerator and a bit of extra RAM in it, compact flash card for your hard drive, Gotek to replace the floppy drive, and off you go. You'll be able to do 95% of what you're going to do on an Amiga 3000 realistically these days. Same thing goes for the 1200. So the main utility I see for big box Amigas these days is to use as a video toaster system. And yes, I am sure there are some Amiga users out there that want to use like a 16-bit Delphina audio card to use the Amiga as a music production system, but we're talking about a minority again, aren't we? So I feel that yes, a video toaster, I can see some really interesting uses of that still in this day and age on an Amiga, but like I say, on the desktop version of these you can't fit it in there. So yeah, you're going to have to butcher the case a little bit. And do you really want to be doing that on something you've just spent £1,500 plus on? I don't think I would want to. Anyway, I've laboured that point enough. That's why I feel that this needs to be in slightly below the Amiga 4000. I think if we purely looked at it from the perspective of what the Amiga 4000 should have been at launch in 1992, then the 3000 was overall a more well-rounded, better thought-out machine than the 4000 was, and I'll explain the reasons for that in its video. But yeah, and also the Amiga 3000 only has ECS, the same as you'll find in an Amiga, late Amiga 2000, the same as you'll find in a late Amiga 500 or 500 plus, the same as you'll find in an Amiga 600. So it's not that special, you know. Like, and why are you going to use the multi-scan productivity mode 640 by 480 in up to 4 colours when you can use high resolution interlace in 16 colours on this flicker free? ECS just really, it just wasn't that great. But anyway, I've talked about stats, specs and all that boring stuff way too much. So yeah, that's why I feel that it just needs a bit of nuance. So yeah, Amiga 3000s is fine, but you know, it's not the be all end all. You can have just as much enjoyment with an Amiga 500 as you can with this, I think. Anyway, that all said, my little experience of having an Amiga 3000. So I bought one in the late 90s for about £150 or so. It was virtually stock, Kickstart 204, dual booted between 1.3 and 204. It had the original 40 megabyte SCSI hard drive, no other expansions. I think it had 1 megabyte of chip RAM, 4 megabytes of fast RAM, 25 megahertz 030 and math coprocessor, and that was about it, kind of thing. Beautiful machine, very rock solid in its default configuration. I added a bridge board to it, which allowed me to use Windows 3.1. It was a Golden Gate 386 SX card, and that allowed me to use applications like Word, Works, Access, Delphi, and Visual Basic. And I could also plug in a VGA graphics card into the ISA slots in the Amiga 3000, which allowed me to use 256 colour screen modes via the use of a KVM, which allowed me to use a single VGA monitor, because obviously the Amiga 3000 was outputting 31 kilohertz through its flicker fixer, and the VGA card could be tied into that, and all worked really beautifully. And obviously adding to that, I could also use Shapeshifter. Really nice little setup I had going there, because I basically could run 3 operating systems all within one box. And in 1999 this still had some utility. You know, using System 7 and Windows 3.1 was still just about okay back at that time. And so this meant that I could complete my A-level computing homework and coursework on it. You know, I could run a version of Visual Basic on Windows 3.1. I got access to some Microsoft applications which ran really well on the Macintosh side of things, some Adobe applications and so forth. And all round, the Amiga 3000 was a fantastic little machine back in the day. And one of the things that I have really great memories of with the Amiga side of things was using CanDo on the Amiga. And CanDo was like the Amiga's hypercard. It allowed you to create visually rich multimedia applications, and I basically created my A-level computing coursework or project on the Amiga 3000. So what did I do? Well, some of you will know that the Amiga operating system after 2.0 came with AREX. Now, AREX is a scripting language, a bit like BASIC, but obviously a different syntax, and allows you to essentially write simple programs. But where AREX really comes into its own is the fact that it can access the functions of applications that have something called an AREX port. And what this allows you to do is essentially to move data from one application to another, or any number of applications, and basically create new stuff with it. Let me give you an example. Say you're writing a bunch of stats and figures in a spreadsheet. If that application doesn't have a database functionality or doesn't allow you to export it in a particular format, you could write an AREX script to export that data in a particular format, which would allow you to use it in another application. How about taking that spreadsheet information and putting it into a database? Yeah, it could do that because it could talk between 2 applications. Or what about an AREX script that could take data from a spreadsheet and then using Dulux Paint draw a pie chart, and then take that pie chart and paste it into a word processing document, and then save it out as an RTF file, and yada yada yada. You could do all of that with scripting. It was very powerful. So my project was to create a headerless email client, and it supported POP3 and SMTP. POP3 is basically an older method for retrieving emails, so reading emails essentially, and SMTP is how emails are sent. So what this was an AREX application. It didn't have a interface, it didn't have a GUI or anything like that. And what it allowed you to do was to download emails from a mail server, like you'd supply your username and password in the script and all this kind of stuff. But download the emails, and then you could take those emails and use them however you wanted to, basically. And likewise, it could send emails as well, along with attachments. So a really simple use of this application would be to, say you was using Final Writer or word processors on your Amiga. You type up your document, but these applications don't have the functionality to send an email. So what you could do, you could write a simple AREX script to take that document, save it as an RTF, attach it to an email, build a really simple little GUI or requester to request information like the email address and the subject line, and it would send it as an email. For an application that never even knew that email existed. Quite funky. The other application, well, there was many applications for this, but the one that was the sort of like the centerpiece of my A-level computing project was to create a email application for people with visual impairments. So I used Can-Do to build a nice, big, clear interface with larger fonts, clearly easable, clickable elements and so forth, high contrast. And what this Can-Do application did is it talked to my headless email client. It would download the emails, display them in the interface. You could read the emails, you could look at the attachments and so forth. Sort of connected to multi-view, so you could look at JPEGs or pings if you had the data types, or sound effects and all that kind of stuff. And it would also allow you to compose emails with attachments. So because the Amiga could connect to a 15 kilohertz like TV essentially, which of course in the late 90s was like basically how all of us were watching TV, on a CRT kind of thing. It meant that you could plug in, say, an Amiga 600 with this Can-Do application, the AREX application, dial-up modem, and it was like a email system for the visually impaired, because there wasn't many options back in the day. I mean, I know Windows had accessibility options, but this took that to the next step, as it were. And yeah, obviously this wasn't going to be a commercially viable system back in the day, but it was a way of kind of creating a system which would have helped out a neighbour of mine who had not neighbour, it was a friend's neighbour, not my neighbour. It's just how I got the idea, basically. They had a visual impairment and struggling to use email. That's how I got the idea. And basically, God, it's funny what you forget over 20 years, isn't it? Yeah, this Can-Do application was a way of easily plugging a TV into an Amiga 600, and you could read your emails, write your emails, send your attachments, all this kind of stuff. So that's essentially what it was, and I did all of this on the Amiga 3000. It wasn't an Amiga application, it wasn't a VB thing, and it did really well. I eventually came out with a B in computing at A-level, and yeah, some good memories of using that Amiga 3000. And I remember that day that I took the Amiga 3000 in to demonstrate this project, because obviously I couldn't run it on the PCs. And we hooked up the TV and all the rest of it, and showed me the application, all the rest of it. All went very well. And they obviously sort of laughed about on an Amiga, because obviously it was a bit of an anachronism by this stage of the Amiga's life. The Commodore was well dead by this point. And yeah, I just remember saying, oh, well, it can also do this. And I showed it booting up Windows through the bridge board, and then started up Shapeshifter or Fusion. I forget what I actually ran on the Amiga 3000. Probably Shapeshifter, the truth is known. And yeah, it showed them it running System 7 as well. And they were just blown away that this little desktop machine was running all these free operating systems, all multitasking, whilst running this, like this email client I'd built. And yeah, it looked pretty hot back in the day. So even though I've ragged on about the Amiga 3000 and slain a unicorn in front of you, I still feel that those memories of the Amiga 3000 are very precious to me. Anyway, I'm going to end it there, folks. I'm sorry I slayed a unicorn, but I feel there are options out there that I think for 95% or so of people looking to buy an Amiga in this day and age will be better served by. But yes, a fantastic system. But yeah, some of its utility has waned, I think, as technology has moved on. Anyway, what do you think? Let me know in the comments down below. Do you disagree with me profoundly? Do you think the Sharp X68000 means I should burn my copy of Strider for the Mega Drive? Or do you agree with me? Other than that, I guess all that remains for me to say is see you soon. Take care and peace.